Moving on to the female reproductive system. We'll be focusing primarily in on the ovary. The ovary is going to be the site of oocyte production, right, the female gametes, and it's also where estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin are produced. Now remember, inhibin is also made in the testes. Do you remember what it did there? We didn't talk about it with the endocrine system, but inhibin in both the male and female reproductive tracts are produced by the gonads and are going to basically be a negative feedback on the pituitary gland, right, on follicle stimulating hormone. So inhibin is produced here as well. So that oocyte production has a lot of things going on. We'll spend some time there. And then we also will spend a little bit of time talking about the uterus. This is, of course, the site of fetal development. In fact, now that I'm thinking about it, we probably talk about the uterus more in chapter 29 when we get into fetal development. So let's take a look at what's going on in the ovary. Okay, oogenesis. Right, so this is going to be the production of oocytes, female reproductive cells, and the final version, the fully mature, the cell, right, is the ovum. Sorry, now I was having a little trouble thinking about how to say that because the ovum doesn't actually become the ovum until fertilization occurs. We'll get there. We'll talk about that, right? But oogenesis shares a lot of similarities with spermatogenesis. So we can move through this maybe a little bit more quickly. So at the beginning of oogenesis, we start with an oogonium. This is the stem cell, right? Just like the spermatogonia. It is going to be in the ovary doing mitosis, right? Cellular division. One of the daughter cells stays behind as another oogonium, right? And the other becomes what's called a primary oocyte. So one becomes the primary oocyte, right? And the other just becomes an oogonium again, right? So that is mitotic division. Now, one thing that's different from the male reproductive tract is that in females, this mitotic division is actually complete before birth, right? So females are actually going to have all of their primary oocytes already produced by the time they're born. Now, this primary oocyte is who's going to undergo meiosis, right? One of the probably the big difference in meiosis between spermatogenesis and oogenesis is that in oogenesis, we are really only going to use one of those 4 daughter cells, right? The products of meiosis were those 4 daughter cells. We are going to put all of our eggs into one basket, right, into a single mature ovum. So basically what happens in meiosis, remember in meiosis 1, we separate those homologous chromosomes, right? So here we see a copy of chromosome 13 and the other copy of chromosome 13. So we've separated them. But what happens in meiosis 1, one of those daughter cells becomes what's called the secondary oocyte. While the other becomes what's called a polar body. Okay. We'll see the exact same thing happen in meiosis 2. So what is this polar body exactly? So what's going on here is while the sperm is delivering genetic material and the ovum is providing genetic material, the ovum provides everything else. All of the organelles, all of the proteins and nutrients that are necessary. What we're going to see is the fertilized egg has to go a few days before it actually implants in the uterus and starts receiving nutrition from mom. So we're kind of packing a bunch of stuff into this ovum. In fact, kind of ahead of time, the cells surrounding the ovum are providing it all of these nutrients. The ovum itself is running through lots of transcription and translation, making sure there's lots of different copies of the messenger RNAs and things that are going to be needed to start that embryonic development, right? So these polar bodies just take the other half of the genetic material and it's shed, it's discarded, which is kind of crazy, right? And instead, we're going to end up with one of those daughter cells and all of the things necessary in that ovum. Do you see how that's different than in the males? Okay. So this meiosis 1, right, and I'll just put M1, right? That's how we go from a primary oocyte to a secondary oocyte. Here's another crazy thing. Cells, basically these cells, primary oocytes, are going to pause in meiosis 1, right? They're actually in prophase of meiosis 1, where all the homologous chromosomes are kind of glued together into what we call a tetrad, and they stay there, right? So when a female is born, all of her primary oocytes are already there, right? No more mitosis needs to go on. We don't need the stem cells anymore. They've begun meiosis 1, and then they just pause, right? We're not actually going to pick up development again of these oocytes until puberty, right? It'll proceed through puberty and then end again at menopause. Okay, so we're paused in meiosis 1, and then at puberty, some of those cells are going to become secondary oocytes. The other thing that we'll see, right, is you're actually born with several 100,000 of these oocytes, but really over a female's reproductive lifespan, she only ends up ovulating around 500 of those eggs. A bunch of these other oocytes that begin development are actually then going to undergo what's called atresia, which is just a fancy word for like degeneration, right? We decide that we're not going to use them after all, okay? We'll talk a little bit about the ovarian cycle and how once a female has reached reproductive maturity, this production of secondary oocytes occurs. And then basically meiosis 2, these polar bodies, I'm just going to abbreviate PB, polar body, whoop, PB, and the secondary oocyte, right, can actually become an ovum, the mature egg, and another polar body, right? So 3 polar bodies and an ovum. So here's the female reproductive system is complex. The secondary oocyte that we have here isn't going to finish meiosis 2 unless fertilization occurs, right? So you actually don't technically get an ovum unless fertilization occurs, right? Meiosis 2 only completed if fertilization occurs. Okay, now this is just kind of the basics of oogenesis, but what we want to look at is how that actually ties in to the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle is a 28-day cycle where we're going to see follicles and oocytes maturing. Now I should say this, a follicle doesn't start maturation on day 1, right, and end in ovulation at day 28. It's nothing like that. In fact, at the beginning of puberty, you'll start to get just kind of waves of these primordial follicles moving on into development of primary follicles, right, and then some even towards secondary follicles. And it's really in this monthly cycle where one of those secondary follicles is going to move towards a tertiary follicle. Okay, so this does take time, years even, for a follicle and therefore an egg to move through this developmental process. Okay, so when a female is born, all of her follicles are in this phase called a primordial follicle. You're born actually with several million primordial follicles, right, all housing primary oocytes. Remember that primary oocyte is paused in meiosis 1. Right? We see the follicle cells surrounding it, but there's not a whole lot going on here, right? And so if you picture the ovary, they're just going to walk us through one of these, but these primordial follicles are all over towards the surface of the ovary. Now, we don't start moving until we hit puberty. When we hit puberty, some of these follicles will start becoming primary follicles. You really, at that point, only have a couple 100,000 of those follicles left. The rest have undergone atresia. So in the primary follicle, what we see happening is those follicle cells start maturing into what are called granulosa cells and thecal cells. These are going to be producing what's called the zona pellucida. The zona pellucida, or clear zone, is going to be this region that starts to develop outside of the oocyte and is going to be filled with glycoproteins and nourishing that oocyte. So the zona pellucida is this glycoprotein-rich zone, and that nourishes the oocyte. Okay. We'll also see that these cells, right, are going to work together to produce estrogens, right, the important female sex hormones. In the primary follicle, you still have a primary oocyte, right? So we could walk through here. There's the abbreviation for primary, right? So we have a primary oocyte. We still have a primary oocyte. This always confuses people. Heck, it confuses me. Again, we're going to keep moving some of these cells towards development, and some are going to basically degrade. Typically, we're going to have one secondary follicle develop each month. Occasionally, it's more than that. So this movement towards becoming a secondary follicle, right? Again, we see the primary oocyte in our secondary follicle, but the follicle is getting larger and supporting that cell. The big step is going to be between days 10 and 14 of the ovarian cycle. This one single follicle is going to progress on to becoming a tertiary follicle. The tertiary follicle is going to grow and enlarge, right? See how big that is? To the point that it's actually bulging the surface of the ovary. Our oocyte is now basically floating in what's called the antrum, this fluid-filled, again, nourishing fluid around the oocyte. The big deal here is that we finally have a secondary, so that's just the abbreviation for secondary, secondary oocyte, which means we've now completed meiosis 1, right? So we have a secondary oocyte and one of those polar bodies. On day 14, this tertiary follicle is actually going to rupture. The surface of the ovary rips open, and this secondary oocyte is going to be released. It gets released out into the pelvic cavity, and it's actually the fimbriae, right? Notice this. Here's our fallopian tube or uterine tube. The end of it, the fimbriae, aren't actually attached to the ovary. These little fingers sit there and pulse. They beat, they pull that, hopefully, they pull that secondary oocyte into the uterine tube. Anyway, I always think that's wild. You just like launch it out there, which occasionally means that pregnancy can occur outside of the uterus. You can have what's called an ectopic pregnancy, and most ectopic pregnancies are actually in that uterine tube, but there are some crazy examples where the sperm actually come through the uterine tube, fertilize that oocyte, fertilize that egg, and it implants on like the intestines, right? It didn't actually get brought into the reproductive tract. Anyway, so our tertiary follicle ruptures, releasing the secondary oocyte. We call that ovulation. All right, so there's a nice picture, that bubble actually ripping out of the ovary. Now, ovulation, do you remember what hormone triggers ovulation? It's a surge in luteinizing hormone. We'll talk about those hormones a little more as well. Now, that tertiary follicle, it's basically going to start bleeding, right, because it ruptured. And as it does that, it's going to convert into what is called the corpus luteum, right, or yellow body. And the corpus luteum is an endocrine structure that produces progesterone. Okay, so for the second half of your ovarian cycle, once ovulation has occurred, progesterone becomes this dominant hormone. Progesterone is the hormone of pregnancy. It's what's going to maintain the uterine lining and prepare it for the implantation of a fertilized egg, if that happens. If that doesn't happen, the corpus luteum scars over, becomes the corpus albicans, right, the white body, because it is scar tissue, right? Fibroblasts actually infiltrate and scar that over so that you stop producing so much progesterone so that you're ready to start this cycle over again. So the ovarian cycle then, the ovarian cycle is what we're looking at here, right? How over the course of a month, some of these follicles are going to develop to the point of ovulation and then produce hormones. So the ovarian cycle is a 28-day, more or less, 28-day cycle. On day 0, right, that is when menses, right, or bleeding, would begin. And then we go until day 28, right down the middle of here, right? On day 14 typically marks ovulation. And ovulation then really splits this ovarian cycle into 2 halves. The first half, from day 0 to 14, is called the follicular phase, right? Because it is dominated by the progression of the follicle till we get to that tertiary follicle that can rupture at ovulation. The second half of the cycle then is called the luteal phase. Okay? And this is because the corpus luteum is producing progesterone, making this a very different set of events. Okay, so follicular phase, luteal phase make up the ovarian cycle. If pregnancy has not occurred on day 28, we say the corpus luteum becomes the corpus albicans, and we go right back to the beginning of the cycle.